Hey everyone, welcome to episode 76 of the Every Thought Captive podcast, where we try to talk about what we think about in a way that honors Jesus. My name is Michael, and I'm here with my friend Chad.
Hey.
And we are here together with our mutual good friend, Mark Christian. Welcome, Mark.
Yes.
Thanks, guys.
And Mark has been on with us before in a previous season. We talked about some church things, talked about when to leave a church, we believe was the topic back then. And he is going to be talking to us. If you heard our last episode, we're kind of continuing along this little mini-series we're doing on leading a church through 2020 and beyond. And what we're doing is we're wanting to talk to leaders of churches in different contexts, different types of churches, different parts of the country, and just to talk through all of what was learned. And we, there for a while, it felt like all we ever talked about was pandemic stuff and 2020 stuff, and it got kind of tiring, and so we stepped away from it. But we're at a point now where we're, relatively close to a new calendar year. We've now experienced couple years of chaos, and so it seems beneficial to look back and to see what we learned. So Mark is the lead pastor at Christ Church of Oronogo, where both Chad and I attend and serve. And so we actually, this is a unique one because the three of us all live in the same city and are members of the same church. Yeah. So it'll be kind of fun to talk about it in that sense, a little bit different than the last one with Rusty in Real Life Church out in California. So Mark, if you would, it feels funny to say you Mark, but call you Mark. I don't know why. I mean, I don't call you anything else, Pastor Mark when I'm talking to my kids.
Pastor Christian.
Yeah.
We just don't use our names with each other.
Yeah. It's true. It's funny. I asked we're going to have a little, I'm not going to try to manufacture anything, but it's a little sweet moment. Seeing you both reminded me. So recently I asked my kids, who would you say are my 5 best friends?
Aw.
And literally they mentioned both of you guys.
Oh, nice.
It was great.
Nice.
Both of
Really?
you. Oh, both of you. Absolutely.
What an
Carson,
honor.
though, was the guy, he's the guy who preaches, he's bald. And I was like, Mark? And he was like, yeah. So it was hilarious, man. Anyway, so Mark, take us back to your church, our church, your church in January of 2020. Before, a lot hit. How are things going? How are you feeling? And what did you think the next season was going to look like or feel like?
Yeah. In 2019, we as a congregation realized that we needed to reframe, repackage how we were going to do discipleship as a church, because it seemed to my heart that a lot of people were attending and that was it. Mm-hmm. They liked, we were Branson on the southwest corner of Missouri, and we put on a good thing that they enjoyed. It was unique, and so they came. And we realized we needed to do something. So we spent all of 2019 as a staff configuring how do we present this pathway of discipleship in such a way that people can self-feed, do it in community, and own some areas of their own life that's not all manufactured by programming. And we were all ready to go. In fact, I have a little bit of pain in my heart when I think back to November and December when I started to hear about this virus. Mm-hmm. And it never once did it fathom it would make it to the U.S., or if it did, we would just, blow something on it, it would all go away.
That's what we were hearing, though. What we were hearing, I remember hearing from people, don't worry about it. You've got a better chance of catching the flu than you do have catching COVID. That was what we all thought.
Mm-hmm.
And when February came and we realized, oh no, it's in the United States and it is not easily dismissed. Mm-hmm. Everything halted. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we were. We were ready for 2020, and God just had a different plan where he's like, no, you're going to sit in this for a while and wait. Yeah. And waiting's not fun.
Yeah. And, I suppose I should be careful to set some of the context because not everyone's familiar with our church. And so some of the specifics, of course, these things can get goofy because numbers make people feel weird. But just in terms of the overall story of the church, small country church out in the middle of nowhere, and it just grew. I don't know at what point it caught fire, but it grew. And the town of Oronogo, I don't know how many people are in actual Oronogo.
About 2,000.
Yeah, and so the church is a little under 3,000. Mark, you've been there now how long?
12 years.
So it was about your decade mark when we were approaching 2020. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of the context for your time there. And you'd led through a lot of seasons. And it's funny, I forgot some of that, but I remember a lot of those conversations with you. Okay, let's talk about how we can take it to the next level. Okay, so still in terms of that moment, early 2020 before things hit, if right now you just had a minute or two to go back and talk to your former self at that point, what would you speak into that guy's ear?
Yeah, mentally I would not have to have changed a single dialogue, conversation. Emotionally, I discovered really quickly into the first quarter of the year that I had an emotional metric on the church that was unfair, unreasonable, and possibly ungodly. And I would never have thought that numbers mattered. But I began to have a fear factor that hit me, like, what happens if we don't recover? What happens if we have to do layoffs? What happens if we have to close this thing down? And that never had entered my mind, and I don't think it should have.
Right.
But because it didn't, I felt exposed, and there was a period of time that I got a little bratty in my prayer life because I was scared. And so I would go back and tell myself in the fall of 2019, we call it Christ Church of Oronogo for a reason, because it's not mine.
Yeah.
And I couldn't stop this. I couldn't fix it. I wasn't at fault for it, but I still found fear. And God was very patient and kind to help me walk through that fear in community. Because by myself, there was a lot of internal panic I was trying to swallow so nobody saw me being weak.
I think that's one of the things that crises do, is they reveal to us all the different things that we're resting in other than in our relationship with God. And that's true for all of us. We're all resting in something. And it's oftentimes they're very good things, but we're still resting in them. And then a crisis kind of throws all that up in the air, and we realize, oh, so this thing is gone now. And I've been putting so much of my weight on that one thing. The big curveball, though, is that March of 2020, we were all thrown into crisis. So we're all having that existential crisis in the moment, you know?
So true. I remember saying, I don't remember, it was before all this, but I remember saying to a friend of mine, I just think I have pretty good, gospel-rooted identity. I'm just not really fazed by a lot of things. And he was like, yeah, well, you're also in a kind of a situation in your life where you're experiencing a lot of wins, and family's in a good place, work's in a good place, all that. And it was a little bit of a check on me, because you don't realize how much you're relying on some of that scaffolding. Okay, so 2020 was the craziest year most of us can remember. The list of things that went wrong is long, and it is spearheaded by a few key ones. A, the COVID-19 global pandemic. Of course, we've already mentioned that. B, the racial tension that followed the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and especially George Floyd. So you had the looting and rioting or protesting. Even how you frame that up became a contested issue. You've got the BLM, the CRT, all those things. And C, we then had a highly flammable political scene. Remember that? Yeah, it's like, we have this extremely tense and contested election season. So before we talk through what you learned from personally and from leading, staff in a church through this time, what else do we need to know about your local context and unique aspects of how some of these things played out, or other hardships that were local to us, to the church, even to you in your own life? So what are some of the other things that make up what you're drawing from when you think back on the seasons?
I'm probably one of the most anti-network people in the entire world. I believe in friendships, not how you use people to get places. So I don't want to read anybody else's. But I'm really grateful for a network of preachers that I've connected with, that we do a retreat every year and we share sermon ideas and encourage each other. Without them, I don't know how this would have played out. What I learned was we're very fortunate.
Real quick,
here.
Mark, how long have you guys been doing that?
Well, two of us have been doing it 30 years.
Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's an amazing gift.
Yeah. It started as two youth ministers who got to preach some, so we wanted to make it good. So we got together and talked, and it's just evolved into a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
Those guys were great. I feel horrible for the three guys from the state of Illinois. So I lived vicariously through a level of pain and pressure that we didn't experience here in Southwest Missouri.
Yeah.
So in the 4 states area, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, I can be in all 4 states round trip. I can touch all 4 states in a 45-minute road trip. So that's what we call this. Around here, our governor in Missouri was very permissive. They gave recommendations. They didn't give edicts. My friends in Illinois went through a far worse thing, threatened lawsuits, arrest, confiscation of property. I mean, all of these implied threats if they didn't.
Divided churches.
And that's what caused all of it. So when I look and I say we were given recommendations, not mandates, we tried to honor community standards. That was not met with much collaboration. Yeah. I was really taken back. More stunned and embarrassed by the fact that I was surprised at the number of people who would not even have a social conversation about caring for one another. We could have disagreed how you care for one another, but we didn't get that far.
Yeah, wow.
It came down to an anger. I've got a collection of emails, not many, but enough to hurt, that people that I love and loved me would come out with such accusation about why we would ask to wear masks. And it was like, why are you making your staff wear masks? And why aren't you making everyone wear masks? And I just thought our situation was no different than everybody else's. But I'm so grateful that we lived in a place where we could do what was best for our church in Oronogo, Missouri, without somebody at the state capitol deciding what was best.
Mhm.
As my friends in Illinois said, the governor treated everybody like Chicago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
those little country communities weren't Chicago. I'm grateful that we had that. So our context was very pliant compared to what some others went through.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when you, so talk us through some of the key things you discovered, sort of a top 5, doesn't have to be 5, can be, but some of the lessons that you learned from all this. Just let's hear what they are.
Yeah, I actually posed this question when I knew you were going to ask me it to some friends of mine, and I asked them what were some of the biggest struggles. I'd like to start with those. So this is this group of preachers, and they're guys from 1 year experience at their church to guys who have decades at their church. And this is what they said. The thing they learned is that you don't know who's committed till they need to be.
Okay.
And that sounds like an indictment. But as Peter Buckland, one of our elders and colleagues, has said before, we found out who didn't love what they thought they loved.
Yeah.
Because they haven't come back.
Yeah.
They just got used to it. Second, expectations placed on us that we were supposed to understand viruses and public health experts. And if you made a mistake, it was almost irretrievable. I'm sorry it didn't work. It was an invalidation. That may be an emotional response, but I felt that a lot too. Like, I didn't go to college to understand
viral infections.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's in fact a lot in ministry today that we can't be trained until we experience it. A lot said, and I agreed with this, that there's a struggle with the fruitless season. We know by Jesus' teaching this is going to happen, but we're often not emotionally prepared for when I always said, I felt like in 2020, I worked harder than I ever worked in a year of ministry and got less done and have less to show for it. And I know God's cool with that, but I found myself, as Chad said earlier, it disclosed an idol in me that was tough to topple. How do you handle the shame from friendly fire?
Yeah.
And I think, Michael being one of our, shepherds at our church, we had these conversations as a group. It wasn't just the shame of, or I'm sorry, this is a bad word. It wasn't just that someone could have got sick on a Sunday morning. It was the ridicule and shame that came from communities on churches that didn't happen in schools, and it didn't happen in, the Veterans Club, and it didn't happen on ball teams. But if a church had an outbreak in their church,
in the news.
Yeah, and we were ostracized and shamed. That was a feeling none of us knew what to do with. And so we lived in a little bit of fear. Because it would be, especially if you were a larger congregation in the area, then it's all about, you just want the money and the numbers. And it's like, that's just not true. And then the challenges of the efficacy of online communities.
Yes.
And this is the ongoing, lingering bruise, is that all the so-called experts told us, well, this is the future. They didn't know the future. They didn't know the virus was coming. How do they know what we're supposed to do in 2022? But the efficacy of the online communities, can it possibly be more damaging to discipleship than helpful?
Right. And I think if we're not asking that question, we at least have to, we're not being honest. We at least have to ask it. Okay, sorry to cut you off.
No, and then probably the few things I take after those conversations with those guys is loneliness is a plague that takes a long time to overcome. And we discovered people in addiction ministries and recovery groups who had to be isolated, and isolation was a curse. And not being able to be with them and draw that into community. I value community now far more than I ever did before.
Okay.
That is my number one takeaway. And I'm an introvert, and I enjoy 2 or 3 hours by myself, but even I had enough of that. And it didn't take me a whole week to realize I miss meandering conversations in coffee shops.
Yeah.
I miss talking about stuff that doesn't matter, like baseball and college football with friends. And when you didn't have that, that was a big thing. The other thing is, I learned that ministry is done in person, in the hospital, at a funeral home. And I still, to a certain part, not to exaggerate this, I grieve over people who had to say goodbye to loved ones in 2020, and we couldn't sit there with them and cry with them and hug them. And, a text that says I care is cool. But when you show up at a graveside and you watch a family take a flower off a casket and press it in a book, and you go through those experiences, it is a beautiful part of ministry. We couldn't do it for an entire year. And there's a sadness to that. And that's what I realized was now I just love that the hospitals are letting us walk in a room again, and I can show up at a funeral home and say I'm sorry in person and cry with them. And I don't mean like fake cry. I mean, you just realize how important this moment is. And we have a lot of people in our churches grieving over the fact that they had to say goodbye and they never got to say goodbye.
So many good words.
Yeah.
First of all, your comment about not being trained or having no experience with epidemiology or knowing how to deal with pandemics. I heard that from a lot of pastors, who were expressing that same sentiment. They were villainized, whatever they decided to do. And sometimes they're villainized they're taking arrows from both sides, I remember having a conversation with Cody Walker, another pastor here in town, and Cody was just saying, really more than anything else, I would love just to experience from my colleagues in ministry, support and encouragement, regardless of our differences. I don't want to take arrows from them when our church decides to do one thing and their church is doing another thing. But there was a lot of that frustration amongst pastors and just leaders of organizations in general. We don't have any training on this, and we're doing the best we can. We don't want to be irresponsible, but at the same time, we don't want to oversee the death of our institution either. We have obligations and responsibilities. We do what we do because we're passionate for it, and we're not just going to be sidelined for month after month after month, turning into a year, turning into two. At some point we're going to have to make hard decisions. So I appreciate that word. And I have a lot of friends in Illinois too that were expressing. Oh,
you do?
They would call me, and I'm I'm probably the wrong guy to call because what you're living through now actually feels a lot different than what I'm living through right now.
Well, and one thing we haven't pointed out that might be relevant in this case, we've joked with you about it in different contexts, but one of the things that I think makes, Chad, your experience of all these things unique is you're in an administrative position at a college in this area. You're a member at this church, and your father's the mayor of our small town in Webb City. And so seeing that from that angle.
My dad's a mayor of a small town in a red state. And also the pastor of a small church in that small town in a red state. Yeah. And I actually told my dad early on in the pandemic, I'm like, Dad, you actually, and he was doing things that he was being responsible. They shut down like a lot of other churches shut down. But I just warned my dad. I'm like, Dad, listen, nothing would be a better headline for CNN or for whatever than to have this small town mayor who's also a preacher at a small church in that small town. And there's this massive outbreak and, dozens of people die. You just need to be aware, they're coming after you. That's like the perfect news story for kind of where this news cycle is at. And he recognized that. But the other thing too that I really want to tag on, because this was a great point. So Tara's a nurse, my wife's a nurse, and one of the things that concerned her and a lot of people at the hospital in the early days of the pandemic was we were delaying surgeries, we were delaying treatments because of concerns about hospital being overwhelmed or whatever. And now we're starting to see some of the consequences of those decisions, and the consequences aren't always good. Matter of fact, they're cancer screenings are way up and what. So we're seeing some of the consequences of putting all of those things on hold. And so one of the things you mentioned about addiction recovery, people who are desperately lonely, these are the people that our churches have to have life on life relationships with, pastoral interventions with, and so many of those people who are so desperate for our ministry had to be put on the back burner. And the painful thing for me, and I think about kids in the youth group, I work mostly in the youth group at Christ Church. So many of the kids in the youth group that were already kind of marginal at the beginning. Oh man. And we haven't seen them.
They're not back.
They're not back. And it pains me.
Yeah. So, we've talked mostly about pandemic related issues, which makes sense. It's pan for a reason, that hit right to home here. Some of the other things, the contentious election, the racial tension. Now those aren't new, but they took on a new flavor based on the unique circumstances and also the interrelationship. Anything that you said that relates specifically to those or any other things, whether it was relearning lessons and convictions that you already had or new ones?
Yeah, I think if, to your point, the thing that I've found, and I want to be careful because I'm not angry about this. In fact, I'm actually glad it came out, like we could have the conversation, But I felt like if you could just make it thirds. One argument was we shouldn't be meeting because it's dangerous, and there was some validity to that concern. And we didn't know whether it was or wasn't, how much risk to take. Back to Cody's comments, I know Cody and I talked on occasion. They took some calculated risks that other people didn't. We took some that other people didn't. And you have to live with the consequences of that. And that's a pressure. It's on the elders. It's on the staff. The other third was they can't deny me my right to worship. And I felt like, if I may, the people I had conversation with, their argument was not, they can't deny me my right to worship. It ended with, they can't deny me my right.
Yeah.
And then there was a third who actually loved gathering and needed the encouragement, like Chad just mentioned. And I found myself having to fight those two polar opposites instead of actually focusing on where the gospel was making an impact and people were like, I will take that risk to worship my God. We also had to correct a lot of bad theology by simply saying your family gathered around a reading of the scripture and a remembering of the Lord's sacrifice. If you can't be in your big community, that may be the most powerful moment your kids remember. But we didn't get to that because we were fighting this. It's unsafe and you're taking too big of a risk. And the other one was they can't deny me my rights. And you had to dismiss those two arguments. And I think that's where a lot of us had to put on the moment where, like, wow, leadership makes you unlikable to a large percentage. And in ministry, you're normally liked because you're in that role. So I think some of the things we all had to face was maturing and simply saying, no, we've made this decision as a group. We're going to go forward with this decision, and we'll accept the consequences because we've been prayerful and doing our best.
So one thing I know we want to talk about, and so we'll just kind of bring it up right now, is with all of these things, pandemic stuff for sure, something like especially the George Floyd tragedy, anytime you have an election, particularly a contentious one, natural disasters, new things in the news, think back to 9/11. I mean, stuff happens that is terrible. And some of it is more localized than others. When it comes to what you talk about on stage and how, what was your approach going into this? How have these various things? How has your approach been confirmed, sharpened, or corrected, or maybe adjusted would be a better way of putting it? Talk to us a little bit about that whole dynamic and how it played out over not just 2020, and that's where 2021. That's the thing is, it's like then 2020 comes along and it's like, oh, is that all you got? I'll see all that and raise you a little more. So talk to us about that.
We're living in an age of microwave responses, and social media, for good and bad, creates that if you don't respond in a timely fashion, and that time is decided by the people that want to know what you stand. If you don't do that quick enough, then you're a coward. And I was called a coward. I wasn't. I believe James 1:19 matters. I'm not hiding behind it. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry.
Right.
That's not a Twitter verse for sure.
Yeah.
And so because of that, when the George Floyd stuff broke out, I received a couple of impassioned emails from staff who said they had a conversation with someone today who doesn't believe the church is standing up for those that are being persecuted and all of this. And I said, well, wait a second, that we have not met together as a body. And what I realized, Michael, in that moment was there is a desire for a public proclamation from the church to the greater community. As a local pastor, though, my audience is not the greater Joplin community. My audience is the flock of people that gather together in the community that's Christ Church of Oronogo. I don't say that because I'm scared to make a proclamation, but I don't think you two want me standing up and spouting off an editorial on the Joplin Globe every week as your pastor.
Right.
So what we had to do is have a lot of private conversations to say, we do not want to microwave a decision to please people that aren't a part of our family anymore. Like I don't want to have a conversation with my son in front of our entire D group about his behavior. And so what we try to do is gather everybody on Sunday. I run it by the elders, so I'm speaking in unified voice and not just my opinion. And that has become more difficult. I'm going to stick to that tactic, even though it's becoming more unliked and unsupported. But I think the desire to have a microwave decision or position on every issue is really strange. And I think of we have a mutual friend, Monty French, who preaches now in Minnesota. Monty wasn't there 2 weeks, he told me today. He was there 2 weeks when this hit.
Wow.
He can't make a public proclamation on these issues on behalf of his church. He's just becoming enculturated into that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the pressure on him to have this bold statement, especially in the state in which it occurred, put him in a position that you just seek the wisdom of the Lord and trust.
Yes.
But we can't hear the outside voice. You've heard me say over and over, I do not want to preach the front page of the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
But when the God's word has something to say, I want to speak to our people first and let it permeate society from our people rather than from a stance. Because I've been doing this for 35 years. I only say that in the last 5 years, there has been a desire for local preachers to make proclamations.
It's been increased.
It was not allowed the first 30 years. No one cared.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So it's different.
Yeah. Well, one
politics
of the things
was, I mean, you never would have brought it up
in certain
ever.
church circles. Yeah. One of the things I think is I have noticed in watching you is it wasn't a policy you developed in this season. It was a conviction that was already in place. You know, I mean, your approach to this stuff has always been that if we preach the whole counsel of God, then all of the relevant issues will be addressed in time. And I think if I remember right, I don't remember the specifics, but a couple of weeks after the George Floyd incident, the text that you had already scheduled to preach actually lent itself quite well to talking about these things. And I thought that was, to me, the fruit of, and we don't always get that lucky, but that was the fruit of your general approach, which has been, let's go to the text broadly, not just back to the favorite ones over and over, and see how it addresses it.
Well, let me tell you why I've come to this posture, and it won't be a long story, but it's an embarrassing one for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've repented of it, and I still carry a bit of shame in my heart because I should have known better, and I just, for some reason, didn't. When 9/11 happened, if I remember correctly, that was a Tuesday morning, and we had a Wednesday night Bible service, and so we just dedicated that whole night to calling the church together to pray and lament and call out to the Lord. And there were a number of people, and here's where I was petulant, there were a number of people who didn't make time on that Wednesday night to come. So on Sunday, they expected the full dose of that, and I became stubborn. And I refused to allow that moment. 50-plus-year-old Mark would have done it differently.
Okay, yeah.
But I was making a point I didn't need to make in the emotions of that moment, and I wish I hadn't.
Yeah.
And we addressed it, but we didn't go into depth. And a lot of people felt something lacking for our response, and I took the wrong moment to fight that fight.
Yeah.
So now I try to respond differently.
We should also mention that Mark, just a couple of years after you came to Christ Church, was leading at the church when the Joplin tornado happened.
Yeah, that's true.
And kind of led us through that as well. So I'm kind of curious, Mark, you mentioned September 11th. Did you learn anything from the experience of leading the church through the Joplin tornado and the aftermath of the tornado that was transferable to how you've been leading in the last 2 years?
Yeah, I think the tornado was so local and it affected families, and we had 30-some families that were displaced because of it. We didn't have any fatalities that we could relate directly to the tornado. Maybe somewhere down the line something happened. Correct. So we didn't have what some of the local churches did. But yeah, what happened in 9/11 and my petulance, the repentance of that caused me to make sure that we didn't just ride that horse around the room every time we gathered, but we didn't stop to realize that now that it's all cleaned up and the roads are cleaned up and all the crews have left, that those families still aren't needing love and compassion. So because it was more personal, I had learned a valuable lesson. When it came to incidents that happen around the country, I tried to find voices in the community that could speak to racism, could speak to some of the prejudice issues that I don't, as a person that I am, I have not experienced. And so I didn't want to attribute without having conversations. So our impact team connected me with some people, and I said, tell me how to talk about this. Because the worst thing you can do is not talk about it, and the second worst thing you can do is talk about it inappropriately.
Right. Yeah. That's helpful, man. And yeah, I've appreciated the way that you've done that. You're not afraid to address, but you're not going to do it right away. And you are going to mostly let it happen within the flow, but at times directly address, pray for, these kinds of things. So thank you in that regard. A couple more things. There's so many more things it would be fun to talk about. How did you balance? So a couple of questions about leadership of staff. I'll throw them together in case the same answer actually kind of covers both. And if they're different, then you can make distinctions as is helpful. One is, how do you navigate differences of opinion among your leaders, so your staff members? And we're assuming here that you could pick any of these issues and they could become an instance for a general principle. And then also, with respect to the pandemic specifically, some people's job duties lessen significantly, at least in terms of what traditionally they would have done with their time. other people's heightened just as, if not more significantly, all the more.
Yeah.
So how'd you navigate or balance, I guess? What did you do about, some of y'all have more work than a human could do. Others of you, at least according to the old frame, don't have enough. What'd you do with all that? So differences of opinion and workload.
I'm grateful for my parents who taught me at a very young age that equal doesn't mean equal. Not my definition of it. Equal means what's fair and reasonable for everybody. So we had a real good conversation with our staff. What I really loved about the people I get to work with is we had to tell some of them it is okay to park the car.
Yeah.
Driving around in a circle doesn't accomplish anything. Being busy to earn your paycheck, you don't have to do that. Rest, lean into the Lord. We're going to wait this thing out. For some, like our creative arts team, wow, we found out on a Tuesday we're going to have to be online on Sunday. Those guys went to work, and they never stopped working. Their fist was balled up tight for months, and they never complained. We just check in on the best we can. Are you guys okay? What do you need? Do you need a break? You guys need to disappear on a Monday and Tuesday. Some of them are like, we can't because we're editing this and editing that. So we started to pull back some of the fine polished stuff. We're very fortunate where we are with CIY and Ozark. We have a lot of resources that a lot of churches didn't get. I never want to be unappreciative of that. But we had to tell some people, driving the car in a circle doesn't accomplish a thing.
Yeah.
Just park it.
Yeah.
And the best part was that it didn't take too long of that people were like, well, can I help with this? And can I help with this? And so the rest was important. We didn't have to, as you know, we thought we might, but we didn't have to lay people off and let people go. Some people went through the horror of that.
Yeah.
And you have to decide, I always laugh when someone tells me that my boss said this is good for me. Well, not when I have a mortgage and insurance and children. It's not good that you take my job.
Right.
But we didn't have to experience that. But we let everybody know, hey, we're going to do everything we can to protect you. You don't have to earn your spot here. You have it. And then when we were able to go back in the summer, people jumped in like ready. And then what we really found out on our team was, for some people it's a job. For some people, it's a ministry. And I was really pleased how many people it was a ministry.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So another one for me, and then Chad, I promise I'll shut up and you throw some stuff in here. So in terms of you, how, I know we have a love-hate relationship with the phrase self-care, not the proper practice, but it can mean weird things, but meant in the best sense. How did you practice, quote unquote, self-care in this season? How did you take care of your own soul and tend to your relationship with Jesus and whatnot? And then also, how did your understanding of your job shift or change? You had some unique family reasons why you were being, careful for a while. So you weren't around as much, and that's hard on you, on the team, all that kind of thing. So in terms of taking care of your own soul and your walk with Jesus, and then also your role, how has this last couple of years impacted those things?
I know you both well enough that you could roll your eyes at this and you can mock me off microphone. I got myself away. 2020 freed me from the addiction to productivity.
Okay.
So what I decided to do was, as soon as I knew in mid-March after spring break happened that we were going to be down for 6 to 8 weeks and it was going to be home, and we weren't going to meet in the office and all of those things, I decided I was no longer going to listen to any podcasts or read any books or listen to any books, primarily when I was walking, that had anything to do with my job.
Okay.
No technical reading. I was going to escape. So I, for the first time, picked up Harry Potter on Audible.
Yeah.
And I walked every day and I listened to Harry Potter. And then I discovered the Wingfeather Saga, which I think is brilliant, by Andrew Peterson. And I started listening to good fiction. I re-listened to Les Mis. And when I walked, I rested, and it wasn't thinking. Most of the time I read technically or listen to anything technical, I'm thinking, I'm horrible. How would I have a job?
Yeah.
And instead I just freed myself from going, just enjoy this season. So now, where I used to read a technical book and then listen or read a fun book, a biography of sports or somebody I wanted to know about, instead of doing that, now it's 2 books for my mind and 1 book for my development.
Okay.
And that was the best self-care. And I also stopped trying to run a sprint every week.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, and that sounds like, self-glory, but instead of having a 55-hour week, it's okay to have a 45-hour week. It's okay.
That's hard.
It's okay.
Yeah.
And I have to tell myself that because I'm still not sure.
Right. I know. I'm not
because
either.
No one's
I know
looking
you're
at
right.
my timesheets.
Yeah.
No one's. I do it to myself, and so I was my biggest critic. And just listening to a good novel that gets me nowhere down the road was probably one of the best things I did. And my wife and I, being at home together and spending time together and going for walks and stuff like that, That was some of the best stuff
It was
we
rich.
had lost raising kids.
What about your job in general and with respect to the different levels of leaders that you're overseeing? And I mean, including just church members and volunteer
Yeah.
staff, all the above?
We have amped up the trust level.
Mm,
I think it was always there, but now it is spoken of,
mm,
where it is okay when a person says, hey, I got a family situation. You don't have to justify that.
okay.
You don't do that very often. If that's real, you go. That's most important. And I really think our whole staff has proven over and over. Work ethic was proven or disproven during 2020.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the best thing for our staff was having conversations. You're okay. For some people, we don't have a lot of people we got to kick to get going.
Right.
A lot of them, we got to tap the brakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was really good to have conversations and to be able to say, man, I respect you, but I didn't get this done. Doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. You were calling on people, you were connecting with people, and that was it. And I think work ethic was proven.
Cool.
I don't want to fall into this trap of romanticizing the pandemic because I know that's I know that's eventually going to happen.
Mhm.
Like eventually, whenever you overcome a crisis or a season of difficulty, there is this tendency to, in a nostalgic sort of way, to romanticize that which you've overcome. Like I hear people talk about the Joplin tornado in the same way today.
Yes.
And part of that's natural. Like, yeah, we should be proud of what we overcame. We should be proud of how we navigated through that difficult season. And so we tend to romanticize it. We tend to like remember it in a little bit different way than it actually was. In saying that though, we recently had this fall break at college.
Right.
We had 2 days off. And so 2 beautiful, gorgeous weather days. And I took an opportunity those days to I kind of went back into pandemic mode a little bit, went on very long walks,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
read recreationally. And it kind of had this twinge of like, oh, I exercised these muscles about 14 months ago.
Totally.
Like that. And it actually made me, it was a helpful reminder. Like, no, there actually is a different way to live.
Mhm.
And for a little while we did experience this different way to live. And again, I don't want to romanticize it because we all in this room, we had certain privileges that
We
other
did.
people didn't have
That's
in
right.
the midst of the pandemic. But it was a good reminder, like, there were some good habits that I wish I would have maintained better,
Yeah.
you know? And some of them I have, but yeah, not to the extent that I would like.
Yeah.
The other thing that I heard you kind of, and you've mentioned this a little bit kind of multiple times, leaders, I think, are addicted to progress. You know, that's how we're calibrated. That line has to be going up and to the right. You know, it might dip every once in a while, but we're addicted to this. Like, no, we have goals,
Mm-hmm.
we have measurables, we know where we're going, or at least we think that we know where we're going. We think we know how we're going to get there. We're leaders. And this is, I think, what's different between leaders and managers. Like leaders are addicted to progress. Like we want our organizations to be more successful tomorrow than they are today.
Yes.
COVID really put a dent in
Yeah.
that ideal, you know, because we, for some of us, like the first time ever in our leadership, like we were forced to recognize the fact that we're not going to be able to make progress in any of the standard ways that we've measured progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're either going to have to recognize that progress doesn't always look the way that we think it's going to look, or we're just going to have to rest in the fact that there are going to be seasons where we're not going to be able to experience that vitality, that growth, that progress. Progress is not guaranteed.
Right.
Like we're not promised that line is always going to move up and to the right. So the real challenge is, how do you personally and organizationally, like how do you deal with the reality when you're struck with the fact that we're going to have to figure out how to navigate this season where things maybe are going down and to the right instead of up and to the right.
Yeah.
But here's my question for you, Mark. So I've used the language here at Ozark more recently about unfreezing the gears.
Mm-hmm.
So during the pandemic, the gears of most organizations were frozen in place. So, you know, I remember right before the pandemic started, we were in this rooted kind of mindset at the church. We were putting a lot of people through the process and the program, and things like that's the direction we're going to go. Okay, cool. You know, sitting there as a person, as a person who serves and attends the church, I'm like, okay, I see the direction. I see where we're going. And then the pandemic hit and everything just kind of froze in place. You know, the gears got frozen. And so we went from, you know, from those plans to now, okay, we're going to have to figure out how to navigate, how to survive, how to move from one week to the next. Instead of thinking 6 months down the line, now we're thinking maybe a week down the line. Mm-hmm. Now we're emerging out of the other end of this difficult season. Hopefully, you know,
at least the shape that it took specifically. Yeah.
And like we've been saying, different parts of the country are emerging at different rates. Right. But a lot of organizations and leaders in organizations are waking up to the reality like, okay, it's time to start dreaming again. It's actually time to start moving that ball down the field again. Now we've learned some lessons. We've taken some hits, but it's time for those gears to come unfrozen. And unfreezing those gears, it takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of vision, takes a lot of conversations. And we're trying to learn that even here at the school, you know, like how do we unfreeze the gears and like get back to the dreaming and the planning and whatever. So I'm just curious, Mark, in your conversations that you've had with the leaders of the church, with the staff of the church, like what has been the approach or what has been the strategy to try to get those gears unfrozen? And instead of every conversation being about COVID, now let's have conversations about, okay, what's next? Yeah. What do we need to be doing?
Well, normally, in my experience, churches will come out with new vision or a new plan or a new tactic based on failure, either perceived failure or proven failure. We get a chance now to reset and realign what we're doing without any other reason except COVID. It is a brand new palette. So we eliminated several things that we were doing because we thought they were effective. And so when we came back and said Pathways was supposed to unroll in the spring of 2020, we had to wait until the August of 2021 to reveal it. We were ready, and it was more directed. We were more ready than ever before. It turned out to be a really good thing. So instead of saying we failed, now we're going to try something different. I think it's different. It's like, are you hungry? Here's the thing, Chad, we weren't ready for that we couldn't anticipate. The team that showed up to practice after COVID was not the team we had trained for the last 10 years. And that's the hard personal part of ministry. And I'm not asking anyone to feel sorry for pastors, just understand us. And that is people that were once very committed to what we were doing, no longer, they haven't returned.
Yeah.
They're sitting home. They're watching it on television. They're going somewhere else. They just disappeared. And when you reach out to them, it's not the response is, no, we're fine. We're good.
Right.
We're good. We're a new rhythm, or you know, we'll be back. We promise. And so we're training a new team. It's almost a reset. Well, that's the term we've used. How do you reset when there's nothing to base it on? It's like, no, we're going to eliminate what was unnecessary and focus on what really matters. So it actually can turn into, I don't want to romanticize it either, because we either lament it or we romanticize it. Yeah. But I look at it and go, this is actually going to be one of the blessings of the reset in our culture, is people that return to church were willing to take risks to come to church. Yeah. And for the previous 50 years, there was no risk to coming to church. It was the American acceptance. I think I've shared this with you guys personally. Being from Michigan for 22 years in ministry, you honestly ask people, do you go to church? Yeah. I moved to Missouri. You only ask them where they go to church. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting.
It's a cultural difference. Mm-hmm. And now we're having people who have decided, I'm no longer going to attend church. And it's going to just, the inside the church family is different now. But the people who came back seem hungry. Yeah. They want more than just attending on Sundays. I think God did us a favor in all of this, in spite of all of the cost and confusion and angst we went through.
And it's funny. There's a fine line in certain ways, but maybe it's a really strong one between good riddance, let them go, and in an almost like hurt anger sort of way. Mm-hmm. And we actually absolutely wish they were still around and more serious about worship. But if they weren't really in, then in some ways, how do you finish the sentence?
Any pastor who is listening to this will understand what I'm about to say, I think. And I seldom speak in that big a generalities.
I know, Go ahead.
But here's the fact. My heart hurts when I walk into a Walmart, or I walk to a gas station, or I go into a restaurant, And the truth is, sometimes I see people I haven't seen in 18 months and I forgot I haven't seen them, and I die a little bit inside. And then I'll see someone in Walmart and they'll smile at me and say, "Hey, Mark." And I'm like, "Hey." And like, they don't come to our church anymore. And I never knew what that, I mean, I knew it all through ministry, but I didn't know in Bible college this would be the reality, is that it's tough not to take it personal. It's tough not to hurt over it. You love them anyway, and if they came back, you would welcome in arms. But there comes a point where you have to allow the prodigal son to walk away. And I don't know how the father did it.
Right.
Because if in my condition, if it hurts me that much, and where it's like I'll be laying in bed at night, I hate to confess this, but I'll have sleepless nights because I ran into somebody at Walmart.
Right.
And I'm like, how did we fail him? How did this not connect? And,
Right.
and I, God is patient.
And this always draws my attention to a particular detail in a really popular text that I really didn't know about. So everybody knows the story of the rich young ruler. Everybody who knows the Bible knows the story of the rich young ruler. This man who shows up to Jesus. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Keep the commandments. I've kept all these since I was a boy. One thing you lack, go sell everything you have. And then he walks away sad. And I am most familiar with Mark's version because that's the gospel that I teach, or the Gospel of Mark. And it is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is the subject when love is the verb. That Jesus is said to love someone is that young man. And it's connected. It's in the context of letting him walk away. And I've always found
say that again.
So it's the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is specifically said to love someone. And it was the one he was letting walk away.
Really?
And I just think there's something deep and profound there.
That's helpful.
Yeah, that I don't always even know what to make of it, but I think something needs to be made of it. And, it's easy to maybe principalize it in different ways. This is what we want to become like, and that Jesus, sometimes the loving thing to do is to let them walk away. And I don't even want to principalize it as much as draw attention to it, that I just think that is in some way profound. When you talk about how hard it is, but that's the call.
But that's also a part of, the pastoral heart, the pastoral sensibility. You and I, Michael, we feel this when we talk about students, right? Like, we have this pastoral heart for our students. Like, we so desperately want to see them succeed. And when they don't succeed, if you have a pastor's heart, like, it just kills you. And sometimes it kills you more than it kills them.
Oh,
and
totally.
That's frustrating,
Yeah.
So I would hope that none of us ever would lose that. There should be a part of us that is always just ate up pastorally. But then, you mentioned the parable of the prodigal son. Like, I've always been struck by the difference in Luke 15 between, like, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the prodigal son. Like, in the lost sheep, the shepherd goes and makes the search, right? But in the prodigal son, like, apparently in that story, like, the son has gone somewhere where the father cannot follow.
He's waiting.
But he is waiting, patiently waiting. And I think patience has to be one of our pastoral sensibilities. And I think that's one of the things that COVID even has taught me.
Yes.
Like, I think before COVID, a lot of us were laboring under the assumption that, it's sort of like the James 4 assumption. Like, whatever, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. We've got all these plans, all these ambitions, and it's all going to work out. It's going to be fine because tomorrow is guaranteed, right? And then we were all woken up to the fact that, well, no, actually it's not. It never has been, but we've been kind of deluding ourselves. And I think pastoral patience requires us to just say, you know what?
Yeah,
I'm ate up by this right now, but I also have to recognize, like, they're making their choices, and I have to trust that God and the Holy Spirit is working in them. And maybe this is the beginning of a beautiful story that I don't know the end of yet.
Yeah. Yeah, it hurts. Somebody should write a song, Love Hurts. I think you could pull this off.
Nazareth,
all right, Mark,
1974.
Yeah, no kidding. We're going to head toward a close here, so you can answer these somewhat briefly. What are some stories or passages or portions of Scripture that have proved especially encouraging to you?
I shared this just recently with another friend. Gideon has always been my archetype in Scripture, in that Gideon was a guy that God called a valiant warrior while he was hiding out in fear. And almost, I don't know, God mocks, but God was picking at him a little bit, I think, and provoking him to say, with me, you can be. And so Gideon goes out and wins these battles. God strips him from 32,000 army down to 300, takes away all their weaponry, basically says, I don't need you, but come with me on this. And he does great things, and everybody loves the story of Gideon. And then after the fact, God says, Gideon, there's something in your backyard. What is that? And it's an idol. And Gideon has more problems, I think, taking the idol down out of his own house than he does fighting a battle without weapons.
Mm.
And in that moment, I thought, God sometimes takes away all of the things we think we're helping him with. And I don't want to accuse it of that, but in this moment, what I realized is every contribution I thought I was making in ministry to help God out was no longer necessary or available.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he still did life change. He still called people to himself. I'll say to everybody, the gospel still works. I actually got to see that proven in this season. So Gideon has been someone I've held on to my entire life, but even this season, I'm like, I see it again.
Yeah.
He's pointing out things in my life while there's no battle that's harder for me than the battle. And so in the midst of that, I just hold on to his story. And it's like, he's not the perfect man. I love it. That Judges is just full of jacked up people.
It is.
And God still shows himself over and over to those who trust him. And so it's not anger when people aren't around, it's hurt. And I value community now more than I ever did. And I'm looking for more ways to have real everyday community, not just through a text thread. It's like, I think God has enriched that.
Good. All
That's
right.
great. One of the things that our friend Jason French, I was talking with him in the early days of the pandemic, and we were just talking about things related to Christ and youth and the school and different things. And, coming out of the Great Depression, there was this tendency amongst a lot of people to save, sometimes hoard physical goods because they went without. And we were talking with each other about, well, I wonder if the people that emerge out of COVID, I wonder if they'll have the same sort of disposition towards community, towards being with and around people. And I think that was an idealistic conversation, obviously.
Sure. I'm thinking like friend pack rats or something,
yeah.
relationship pack rats.
So some people are still very much in their digital world.
Sure.
But I've noticed that with a good number of people, there has been this more eagerness, openness, just leaning into community and even physical places with people. I might have talked about it on this podcast, but Mark, one of the most meaningful experiences of me that I had in the season of COVID was our first Sunday of Advent last year. And I just sat there and Michael and I have joked about this. As we get older, we both get a little bit weepier,
Yes.
But I remember sitting there and just like weeping, and it was just the worship, the message, but then just hearing other people, being in their presence. It was just an amazing experience. And that's what I grieve that people have lost. Like, do you know what you've lost? Do you know what you've walked away from? Like, this is just, this is so life-giving, and you just have walked away. It doesn't make any sense.
I know we're pressed quickly. Sunday, I got to stand backstage before I get the privilege of walking out to preach, and I saw our worship team walk away from the microphones because the congregation took the song from them.
Oh, wow.
And sang it at whatever speed they wanted to, and you could hear the voices. And the worship minister and I both walked off stage and looked at each other, and I had tears in my eyes, and I said, I'm not apologizing. And he smiled because I took that for granted for 30 years.
Yes.
And to see people so enjoying a song that expresses a feeling that I don't ever want to lose what I lost. And I think that that's the joy of the community, and those who have it are holding on to it for dear life.
I'm kidding. Well, two quick wrap-up questions. So second to last question. Let's say we're writing the story of Christ Church of Oronogo. If the current chapter encompasses 2020 and 2021 and is therefore coming to a close, and it's on you to title it, what are you calling it?
It's recrossing the Jordan.
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's good. Okay.
It is like we got backed up, and we ended up fighting for Egypt. Wow. Like trying to return back to Egypt, and Egypt's gone. It's over. And so I would say it's recrossing the Jordan for us.
That's good. Okay. And since you know the future, what would you pre-title the next chapter? And more seriously, what do you think is next for where God is leading the church where you serve, as well as the church at large?
I think that in our context around here, I think God's going to break up the large mass meetings.
That's what Rusty said.
Yeah, because I think he's going to break up the large church mass meetings because it's not producing discipleship. It's inspiring, but it's not inspiring toward discipleship. And so because of that, I think that there's going to be this era of people getting back to these community groups that matter to them,
Yeah.
and finding enough in that instead of searching for the big and the huge. They're going to go back for the meaningful again.
Yeah.
I hope that's what happens.
Wow, this is so interesting to me. We were just talking before the show about you guys have never met, and I mean, this by the time this releases, that one will have been released, but it just happened a couple of days ago. You guys, we haven't talked about this, you haven't heard it, and these will be the only two where there's no chance that the person who we're talking to has heard the others. And here, the two of you, very different contexts, different histories, have both said that small seems to be a next step. How fascinating. Man, dude, thank you so much for your time. It's been a blessing to us. Often we tell our students, hey, your life may be hard right now, but guess what? You don't get to say. I never prepared for a pandemic during Bible college. Yes, you did, so you had to handle this on the fly. And I, of course, many tragedies, but that is, I think, one of the benefits for younger leaders is to be able to learn from something like this for whatever may be coming. So thanks for sharing openly and honestly.
It's great. It's great. Mark, thanks for being here. For Michael and for Mark and, just for myself, because that's the only three of us here today. Doug and Jeff, we miss you. Hey, this has been Every Thought Captive. We'll keep this conversation going next time.